methods and 2 assessment methods. Now, obviously, there will be various combinations of them, but this is just kind of to make this point. So 2 teaching methods, game-based and traditional. And by traditional, I mean anything that isn't game-based. So it is possibly a bit of a misleading term, because it could be a modern and innovative teaching method, but it's not game-based. And 2 assessment methods, so in-game and external. Now, in-game refers to using the built-in features of the game, such as the scoring or the leveling up, to assess progress. And external refers to a variety of assessment methods that can potentially be integrated into the game-based learning scenario. Now, of course, it's possible to mix and match the different types, and actually this is what more often happens in practice. Okay, Amanda.
Okay, I seem to be dominating here, but this is where I brought up the idea of ipsative before. Ipsative assessment means that the learner can actually assess how they're going as they do the course, because if they keep playing the game over and over again and realise that they're getting better, they're measuring against their own performance beforehand and not an external thing. So that's a sort of a very unique thing the game can offer a learner, that sort of unpressured assessment.
I agree with that, and I think that's quite important. That I think some of the things you talk about in terms of the pressure and the time depends on how the game's used. So, for example, one of the examples I'm going to give in the case study is of a game being used simply for the assessment, so that it's not something that people can use as a learning tool as well as an assessment tool, which I think has downsides. I like the way that this particular example is used. I think you're absolutely right. But what I'm going to talk about on the next slide is some of the downsides, which are to do with the reflective process and the purpose of assessment as a learning tool. So I'm not going to preempt that now, but hopefully by the end of the next slide, that will make more sense, if that's okay. Right, I'm just looking at where I am now. Okay, so you can mix and match different assessment methods. Now, the other point I wanted to make is that it's really important that the assessment method, and I'm presuming, since you all know assessment, I am actually teaching grandmothers to suck eggs here, but the same is true for game-based assessment as for any type, that the assessment method must match the learning activities and be appropriate for learning outcomes. So, for example, and I have seen this happen actually, a course taught with lectures and then using a game to assess. So you're using a more didactic teaching method than an interactive assessment method. Likewise, to run a course on game-based learning principles and then assess with an exam. Now, this second example is quite common because people will want to input some sort of change in teaching, which typically in the UK is quite easy in terms of our modification and validation systems to put in change teaching, much more difficult to change assessment. Okay, sorry, I will slow down a bit. I'm just a bit wary of time, and I think I'm going a bit slow. But okay, so
sorry about that, Nick. But the delay across the Pacific, across the world, and it adds to the lag, and it gets very crushed up.
Okay, no worries. I'll try and talk a bit slower. Okay, so while games do offer a host of pedagogic advantages, which I hopefully have convinced you about on previous slide, they're typically, a lot of them, again, I don't like to make sweeping generalizations, but really poor at fostering reflection and metacognition about the learning process. And this is where I believe that well-designed assessment can play a role. So in-game assessment, where learners are being assessed essentially by how well they perform in the game and things like scoring and leveling up and so on, has the advantage it's automated so that you don't have to go off and mark people. It's repeatable, so therefore theoretically it's more equitable because anybody who goes into the game can have the same experience. You're not relying on a marker to use their own judgment. It's doable without breaking the flow of the game, so players can be assessed without realizing. However, external assessment offers more creativity, more teacher control, but again, like any type of tutor-marked assessment, it's more time-intensive. There's also an issue of the levels of learning outcomes. So linking lower-level learning outcomes, by which I mean things like recall, comprehension, to game scoring and progression, is quite straightforward. But this is trickier when you're starting to look at the higher levels, because things like analysis, critical thinking. And this isn't just for game-based learning, this is to do with any type of automated assessment, because you're looking at using a quantitative method to try and assess something that's qualitative. The other problem with games, if they're used as a sole method of assessment, is that you're actually only assessing the product. You're not looking at the process of how someone got there. Now, as Amanda said, if you're using a game which is used progressively so that the student is able to use it over and over again, but is given some space for reflecting about how progression in the game actually relates to progression in the real world and relates to the learning outcome, then you have something which is both a learning tool and an assessment tool. If you simply have something that's used as an assessment without explaining to the student how what they're doing in the game relates to anything to do with learning, then you have something which I think is quite different. Now, while integrated in-game assessment is sometimes heralded as the new way forward because of its embedded nature and the engagement potential, and we're going to have a whole different type of students, and they need to learn with games, and they need to be assessed with games, and they need, if we actually tell them they're learning, then we're not going to engage them. I have a number of quite serious issues with the idea of using solely embedded in-game assessment, which I'm going to talk about on this slide. Now, I think there are quite a lot of pitfalls with this model, which is important to consider when you do, and this is not to say don't use in-game assessment, and again, one of the case studies I've got is quite a nice example of how to use it. But it's important to remember the pitfalls as well as the benefits. And the first problem, and this is one I've really touched on a bit with Amanda anyway, is related to the purpose of assessment, which I don't think should simply be to test. Now, I know that many people in our UK school system will disagree with me, but I think, and definitely in higher education this is becoming more common, this idea of assessment for learning, it has to be an integral part of the learning process. And as I said before, games don't typically offer space for reflection. They don't give you space to consolidate what's learned, consider how to apply the learning to other contexts or situations. Now, this is often remedied through additional out-of-game activities, so debriefing, briefing, reflection, group work around the game, or through assessment. And assessment, if it's designed in with the game at the same time, it can provide this space for reflection. It can get people to think about the learning process. It allows you to get feedback which is outside the game. In-game assessment doesn't facilitate this. I mean, I'm not saying it wouldn't be possible to design in-game assessment like that, but then you're actually losing some of the engagement benefits of in-game assessment. This is the fact that in-game assessment doesn't provide any evidence of transferability of learning to other contexts. I think this is really worrying. While game-based learning, particularly immersive game-based learning, has the advantage that people can go into other contexts and situations and try things out, and it can be experiential, without some assessment that has an awareness that you're actually in an artificial world and looks at how you can apply what you're learning in this artificial world to the real world or another world, then all that we're really assessing is, can you play a game? Just because you can achieve something in the game doesn't mean that you can then transfer that. So I think in-game assessment has a big issues of assessing transferability. Yeah. I like Gary's comment. Again, I've talked before about how difficult it is to link learning outcomes to gaming outcomes anyway when you're designing a game. Now, in the case of assessment, this gets compounded because how can you be really sure that you're actually assessing what you think you're assessing? There's issues of validity, there's issues of reliability, which I don't think that actually many people who design game-based assessment actually look at or think about. How do you know that you're actually testing what you want people to know and not just how good someone is in the game? And this is an issue of all types of automated assessment, but I think it gets compounded by the fact that you have the whole game mechanic and mechanism around it. Assessing game performance, I think, is troubling really for two reasons.